picture this. You walk into a courtroom, but it's not your typical courtroom.
Yeah.
No, this was once a place of military power, now transformed into the setting for an absolutely unprecedented trial. And this isn't some kind of alternate history. This is the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, or, as is better known, the Tokyo trials.
Ah, the Tokyo trials.
And today we are diving deep into a Wikipedia article that really breaks down the trial's origins.
Okay.
The key players involved, the controversies that surrounded it, and, what it means for us in the world even today.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the location. That really sets the scene, doesn't it? I mean, the fact that these trials were held in a former Imperial Japanese Army building, I mean, that in itself speaks volumes about the symbolic weight of everything that took place there.
It really does. This wasn't just about, punishing individuals for their actions. It was about grappling with, the actions of a whole nation, whole empire.
Exactly. And, a lot of people, they draw parallels to the Nuremberg trials, which is natural. But the Tokyo trials were unique in several really key ways. Like, for one, they weren't just focused on World War II. They actually went back even further, like all the way back to 1931, examining Japan's actions, starting with the invasion of Manchuria.
So they were looking at a much longer period of time, trying to really understand the deep roots of, I guess, Japan's militarism and aggression.
Yes, precisely. They were really trying to get at the heart of what they called crimes against peace. And this wasn't just about wartime atrocities. It was about holding leaders accountable for the very act of starting a war.
That's a really interesting distinction. So it was about trying to prevent future wars, not just punishing past actions.
You got it. And this was actually a very novel concept at the time, and it actually formed the basis for, they had these unique categories of charges at the Tokyo trials called Class A crimes.
Okay.
And these were the big ones. They were focused on the planning and the waging of aggressive war, which set them apart from Class B, which dealt with the more conventional war crimes, and then Class C, encompassing crimes against humanity.
Okay, so 3 classes of charges, each one representing, I guess, a different level of responsibility and a different type of offense. But let's talk about, for a moment, the human element here. Who were these defendants? We're not just talking about nameless entities, right? These were individuals who were once in positions of power. Yeah, it's easy to think about these historical figures as being, almost two-dimensional, kind of like characters in a book or something. But these were real people, right? Driven by their own ambitions, their own beliefs. And 28 of them found themselves in the dock at that former army building facing charges that could have led to, the death penalty.
Yeah, you're right. And it's really a fascinating cross-section of Japanese leadership at the time. You have military leaders, you have government officials, you even have ideological influencers. I think to really kind of wrap our heads around the complexities of this period, it's helpful to kind of delve into a few individual stories, really put some faces to these names.
Absolutely. So instead of us just listing names, can you take us a little deeper into the lives of a couple of these defendants?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with Hideki Tojo. Now, Tojo was a career military man. He rose through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army and eventually became prime minister during a pretty crucial period of the war. He was known for his strict discipline, his hawkish stance on expansionism, and this really unwavering commitment to what he saw as Japan's destiny.
So Tojo really embodies that image of kind of the unyielding military leader, deeply entrenched in the ideology that led Japan down this path.
Precisely. But then you have someone like Koki Hirota. Now, unlike Tojo, Hirota, he was a military man, he was a diplomat. He served as both foreign minister and prime minister. And he was known for his diplomatic skills, but also for his role in kind of shaping Japan's foreign policy during those really tumultuous years leading up to the war.
So we have Tojo, the military strategist, and Hirota, the diplomat. It's almost like 2 sides of the same coin, right? Both instrumental in Japan's path to war, but with these vastly different backgrounds and approaches.
That's a really keen observation, and it really gets to the heart of why the Tokyo trials were so complex. These individuals weren't just acting on their own, they represented a system, a whole ideology that had taken hold in Japan.
It's a good reminder that history is rarely made by individuals alone. It's the convergence of ideologies, systems, and then those individual actions, that really shape the course of events. And speaking of actions, what were the prosecution's main arguments during the trials? What evidence did they use to build their case against these 28 defendants?
Well, the prosecution's case, it was multifaceted. They argued that Japan, fueled by these expansionist ambitions, had deliberately embarked on this really systematic campaign of conquest throughout Asia and the Pacific. They meticulously documented this pattern of aggression, really beginning with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, which they argued was kind of like the first domino-fall in this much larger scheme.
So the prosecution wasn't just looking at isolated incidents. They were really trying to establish this pattern of intent, a deliberate strategy of expansionism.
Exactly. They argued that Japan's actions were premeditated, calculated moves in this grand strategy that ultimately led to the Pacific War. And to bolster their case, they didn't just rely on, interpretations of military maneuvers or political speeches or things like that. They presented this vast amount of evidence documenting the horrific atrocities that were committed by the Japanese military.
We're talking about events like the massacre at Nanjing, the Bataan Death March, the horrific system of comfort women.
Yes, and they presented all of this as evidence to illustrate, really, a systematic pattern of brutality, a disregard for human life that, they argued, was woven into the very fabric of Japan's wartime conduct.
It's difficult to even comprehend the suffering endured by so many. But how did the prosecution directly link these specific atrocities to the defendants, many of whom weren't physically present during these events?
Right, and that's where this really critical concept of command responsibility comes into play.
Okay.
It was a legal doctrine also used at the Nuremberg trials, which placed responsibility on military commanders and political leaders for the actions of their subordinates, even if they didn't directly order those actions.
So ignorance wasn't a valid defense. If you were in a position of power, you were accountable for the actions of those under your command, whether you specifically ordered them or not.
In essence, yes. The prosecution argued that the defendants, just by virtue of their positions of power, either knew or should have known about the atrocities being committed and had a duty to prevent them.
It's a legal concept with huge implications.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised that it was a major point of contention during the trial.
Absolutely. It raises these really complex questions about accountability, especially in the chaos of war. But for the prosecution, it was a key pillar in their case. They needed to demonstrate that these 28 individuals, even if they didn't personally commit these crimes, bore responsibility for them.
And to really drive their point home, they needed more than just legal arguments. They needed, tangible evidence. So we talked about the prosecution's efforts to establish that pattern of intent and connect those atrocities to the defendants through, this whole idea of command responsibility. But I'm also thinking about something you mentioned earlier, that mountain of evidence that they presented. What were some of the key pieces of evidence that they used?
Well, they used a variety of sources. I mean, you have official documents, military logs, diaries, photographs, and then, of course, eyewitness testimonies from both victims and perpetrators. One document, in particular, the Tanaka Memorial, became a real focal point of the prosecution's case.
Right. The Tanaka Memorial. You were about to tell us more about it at the end of the last part. This document supposedly outlined Japan's, grand strategy for expansion, right?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. It was supposedly a secret memorandum presented to Emperor Hirohito in 1927 by Prime Minister Tanaka Gichi. It outlined what the prosecution argued was Japan's roadmap to dominating Asia and eventually, the world, through a series of military conquests.
So if authentic, this document would have been a bombshell, right? It would have provided seemingly irrefutable proof that Japan had been plotting this all along.
Precisely. It was presented as the smoking gun, evidence that Japan's actions were, premeditated and calculated, dating back, years before the war even began.
And there's always but in history, isn't there, you use that word, if authentic.
You're right to pick up on that. And here's where it gets really intriguing. Most historians now believe that the Tanaka Memorial was, in fact, a forgery, likely fabricated in the 1930s as anti-Japanese propaganda.
Wow, so the prosecution's smoking gun might have been a dud. That's a pretty significant detail. What does this revelation say about the trial itself?
Well, it certainly raises some questions about the strength of some of the evidence presented, at least in this particular case. And it really underscores how easily historical narratives can be manipulated, especially in the, politically charged atmosphere of war and its aftermath.
Yeah, it really makes you think twice about accepting historical narratives at face value, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a good reminder to approach all historical sources with a critical eye, especially when you're trying to, unravel events as complex and consequential as the Tokyo trials.
So the Tanaka Memorial might have been a fake, but the defense couldn't have solely rested on discrediting one piece of evidence. What other arguments did they present? How did they counter those accusations of systematic aggression and, command responsibility?
Well, the defense team, a mix of Japanese and American lawyers, they argued that this concept of crimes against peace, this whole idea of waging aggressive war, was a relatively new one in international law. They argued that it hadn't been clearly defined at the time that Japan was making these decisions. It's almost like they accused the IMTFE of, changing the rules of the game after it had already been played.
So the defense was essentially arguing that, like, the goalposts had been moved, that actions weren't necessarily illegal when they were committed.
Yeah, that was a major part of their argument. They really challenged the very foundation of some of the charges, arguing that the IMTFE was engaging in, what you hear sometimes, victor's justice, punishing actions that weren't technically illegal under international law at the time.
It's certainly a thought-provoking argument. And international law isn't static, right? I mean, it evolves over time. So where does that leave us in terms of accountability for past actions? It's a debate that continues to this day.
It certainly does, and it really gets to the heart of how international law works, how it changes, and whether you can really hold individuals accountable for actions that, while morally reprehensible, weren't technically illegal under international law at the time they were committed.
It's a very nuanced issue with no easy answers. But to go back to the defense's strategy for a moment, they also challenged the idea of command responsibility, didn't they?
They did. They argued that in the chaos of war, with communication lines, often fractured, it was unfair to hold individuals accountable for the actions of their subordinates, especially when those actions weren't explicitly ordered or perhaps, even known about.
That makes sense. Trying to establish like the chain of command and pin down culpability, I mean, amidst the fog of war,
Yeah.
must have been incredibly difficult.
Exactly, proving intent and direct involvement, especially years after the fact. I mean, it's a formidable challenge, even with extensive evidence.
The defense team also brought up the issue of the trial itself being held by the victors.
They did, and they questioned whether a tribunal composed entirely of judges from allied nations could ever truly be impartial. They argued that true justice required a more neutral arbiter. And it was a perspective that resonated with some and further fueled that whole debate about, victor's justice.
It's a critique that has been leveled at, I mean, many international tribunals throughout history. But even with these arguments, the question that lingers for many is the absence of one key figure. Emperor Hirohito. I mean, he was the symbolic head of state, yet he wasn't even on trial. Why was that?
That's the million-dollar question that continues to spark debate and controversy. The short answer is that the United States, primarily General MacArthur, who is essentially in charge of occupied Japan, made the decision to grant Emperor Hirohito immunity from prosecution.
Immunity? That's a big deal. Why would they make that decision?
Well, they believed that they believed he was essential for a smooth transition to a peaceful and democratic Japan. The concern was that putting him on trial, or worse, executing him, would throw Japan into chaos, making the rebuilding process infinitely more difficult. And they needed a stable Japan, especially as the Cold War began to take shape.
So a combination of factors: political expediency, concerns about stability, and perhaps, a recognition of the complexities of his position. But this decision to grant him immunity, I mean, it wasn't without its critics, was it?
Not at all. Many saw it as a grave miscarriage of justice, letting the person at the very top of the system, off the hook, while others were held accountable for their actions. It fueled that perception of victor's justice, and it's left a lasting mark on the legacy of the Tokyo trials.
It's easy to see why that decision continues to generate such strong reactions even today. It speaks to the challenges of balancing these ideals of justice with political realities, particularly in the wake of such a devastating conflict.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that history is, it's rarely neat and tidy. There are often more questions than answers, more shades of gray than black and white.
So true. The Tokyo trials, even with their complexities and controversies, were undoubtedly a watershed moment. I mean, they marked the first time that leaders of a defeated nation were held accountable in an international court for waging war and committing atrocities.
And we can't forget the sheer scale of this legal undertaking. It lasted over 2.5 years, involved hundreds of witnesses, and generated, literally millions of pages of documentation.
And the trials themselves were really just the beginning. In their aftermath, thousands of other war crimes trials took place throughout Asia and the Pacific.
Yes, the Tokyo trials had this ripple effect, shaping how nations grappled with the issue of wartime atrocities and prompting a wave of legal proceedings that sought to bring perpetrators to justice.
It's a reminder of the long and arduous process of reckoning with the past.
It is. And that process, as we've seen with the Tokyo trials, is rarely straightforward or, without controversy.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, grapple with, very complex legal questions, and acknowledge the limits of what any trial can truly achieve.
It's been a fascinating deep dive into a truly pivotal moment in history. And while we've covered a lot of ground from the origins and purpose of the Tokyo trials to the key players, the evidence presented, and the verdict itself, we've honestly only just scratched the surface.
That's the nature of a deep dive, though, isn't it? It's about sparking curiosity, not,
Right.
not providing all the answers.
Exactly. So to our listeners, we encourage you to, explore further, delve into the individual stories of the defendants, examine the evidence for yourself, and, consider the broader historical context. And as you do, just ask yourself, were the Tokyo trials a flawed but necessary step towards justice, or did they fall short of delivering, true accountability? There are no easy answers, but the journey of discovery is well worth the effort.